Every single day, about 60,000 people in the United States alone are put under general anesthesia. 60,000. A doctor places a mask over their face or slides a needle into their arm, and within seconds, the person is gone. Not dead. Not sleeping. Gone. Their eyes close. Their muscles go slack. You can cut them open with a knife and they don't flinch, don't scream, don't remember. An hour later, 2 hours, 5 hours, the drugs wear off and they come back. They open their eyes. They're confused for a minute. Then they're themselves again. Whole, intact, as if nothing happened. We have been doing this for over 150 years. We do it with extraordinary reliability. The mortality rate from modern anesthesia in a healthy patient is something like 1 in 200,000. We are very, very good at putting people under and bringing them back. And we do not know how it works. I don't mean we're a little fuzzy on the details. I mean the fundamental mechanism, the actual answer to the question, why does this molecule make consciousness disappear, is not known. We know what the drugs do to certain receptors. We know which brain regions change their activity. We have correlations and models and working hypotheses. But we do not have an explanation. Not in the way we have an explanation for, say, how antibiotics kill bacteria, or how a vaccine trains the immune system, or how aspirin reduces inflammation. Those mechanisms are understood at the molecular level, cause and effect, step by step. Anesthesia is not. And that means something remarkable. It means we have been turning off human consciousness routinely, safely, millions of times a year without understanding what consciousness is or how exactly we're switching it off. That would be like successfully flying airplanes for 150 years without understanding aerodynamics. It works. Nobody argues that it works. But the why is a hole. A deep, strange, philosophically charged hole. Tonight I want to walk into that hole with you. I want to look at the clues. Because there are clues. Fascinating ones. And the more you follow them, the stranger the situation gets. Let me start with what most people assume, because it's wrong. And the wrongness is the first clue. Most people assume anesthesia is a kind of very deep sleep. The doctor gives you a drug that makes you sleep so heavily that you don't wake up when they cut you. Like a sleeping pill cranked up to maximum. Stronger dose, deeper sleep. That's the intuition. But that's not what happens. Anesthesia is not sleep. It's not a deeper version of sleep. It's not on the same spectrum as sleep. The brain under anesthesia looks fundamentally different from the brain during sleep, even the deepest stages. Let me show you why. During natural sleep, your brain cycles through stages. You've probably heard of REM sleep, rapid eye movement, the stage where you dream. And you've heard of deep sleep, sometimes called slow-wave sleep, where your brain produces these big, rolling, synchronized electrical waves. During a normal night, you cycle between these stages multiple times. Light sleep, deep sleep, REM. Light sleep again, round and round. Here's the critical thing. During all of these stages, your brain is active, intensely active. During REM sleep, your brain is nearly as active as when you're awake. Neurons are firing all over the cortex. You're processing information. You're dreaming. You're constructing entire fictional realities inside your head. Even during deep slow-wave sleep, when the big slow oscillations are rolling across your cortex, there's a complex pattern of activity. Neurons fire together in bursts, then go quiet, then fire again. It's synchronized, but it's not silent. The brain is doing something. Something organized. Something purposeful, as far as we can tell. Now look at the brain under general anesthesia. The picture is completely different. Under a typical anesthetic like propofol, the most commonly used drug, the cortex becomes profoundly suppressed. The fast, complex, irregular activity of the waking brain is replaced by very slow, very high amplitude oscillations. But these aren't the same as the slow waves of deep sleep. The pattern is different. Under propofol, you see a characteristic signature called burst suppression, brief flurries of activity alternating with periods of near-total electrical silence. The EEG goes nearly flat, then bursts to life for a moment, then goes flat again. During the flat periods, large populations of neurons are simply not firing at all. That doesn't happen in sleep, not in any stage. Sleep suppresses certain kinds of activity and reorganizes others. Anesthesia, at surgical depth, squashes cortical activity to a degree that sleep never approaches. If natural sleep is the brain running a different program, anesthesia is closer to the brain being partially shut down. Not off, not dead, but suppressed in a way that's qualitatively different from anything that happens naturally. There's more. During sleep, you can be woken up. A loud sound, a shake, a bright light. Your arousal systems can be activated and pull you back to consciousness. The pathways are all intact. They're just not being engaged at the moment. Under anesthesia, those pathways are chemically blocked. A loud sound doesn't register. Pain doesn't register. The arousal systems aren't just idle. They're actively being suppressed by the drug. The off-ramp back to consciousness has been pharmacologically barricaded. And here's something that really separates the two. Dreams. During sleep, you dream. Your brain generates complex narrative experiences. Under most anesthetics, at surgical depth, you don't dream. You don't experience anything. When patients wake up from anesthesia, the overwhelming majority report a gap. Not a fuzzy, dreamlike gap. An absolute gap. One moment they were counting backwards from 10. The next moment they're in the recovery room. Nothing in between. No sense of time having passed. No dim awareness. Nothing. People who have been under anesthesia often describe it differently from sleep in a very telling way. After a night's sleep, you have some sense that time passed. Maybe you don't remember your dreams, but you feel like you were somewhere. After anesthesia, the experience is more like time was deleted. Not experienced and forgotten, but not experienced at all. That's a different thing. That's a profoundly different thing. And it tells us that whatever anesthesia is doing to the brain, it's doing something that sleep does not do. It's not just turning down the volume, it's changing the channel. Or rather, it's unplugging the television. So the first clue tells us what anesthesia isn't. It isn't sleep. Now let's look at the second clue, which is historical, and which is genuinely one of the strangest facts in the history of medicine. Anesthesia was discovered before anyone had the slightest idea how it might work, and the range of substances that can produce it is absurd. The first successful public demonstration of surgical anesthesia was on October 16, 1846. A dentist named William Morton administered diethyl ether to a patient at Massachusetts General Hospital, while a surgeon named John Collins Warren removed a tumor from the patient's neck. The patient didn't scream. He later said he felt no pain. Warren reportedly turned to the audience and said something close to, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." The era of painless surgery had begun. But ether wasn't the only game in town. Within a few years, chloroform was being used widely, especially in Britain. Then nitrous oxide, laughing gas, which had actually been noticed for its pain-relieving effects decades earlier by Humphrey Davy back in 1799, but nobody thought to use it for surgery. Then came a parade of other agents over the following century. Cyclopropane, halothane, enflurane, isoflurane, sevoflurane, desflurane. And alongside the inhaled agents, injectable ones, barbiturates like thiopental in the 1930s, then propofol starting in the 1980s. Here's what's strange. Look at these molecules. Diethyl ether is a simple organic molecule, 2 ethyl groups bonded to an oxygen. Chloroform is a single carbon with 3 chlorines and a hydrogen. Nitrous oxide is 2 nitrogens and an oxygen. Cyclopropane is a ring of 3 carbons. Halothane has fluorine, chlorine, and bromine hanging off a 2-carbon chain. Propofol is a phenol ring with two isopropyl groups. These molecules have almost nothing in common chemically. Different sizes, different shapes, different elements, different functional groups, different charges, different everything. And yet they all do the same thing: they make consciousness vanish. That's deeply suspicious. In pharmacology, when one specific molecule binds to one specific receptor and produces an effect, that's a lock and key mechanism. You understand it. The shape of the molecule matches the shape of the receptor site. But when a wildly diverse zoo of molecules, some no bigger than 3 atoms, some with complex ring structures, all produce the same basic effect, that tells you the mechanism is probably not a specific lock and key interaction. Something else is going on. Something more general. Something about a physical property that all these molecules share rather than a specific chemical structure. And that brings us to the third clue, the Meyer-Overton correlation. In the late 1800s, 2 scientists working independently, Charles Ernest Overton and Hans Horst Meyer, noticed something remarkable. They found that the potency of an anesthetic, how little of it you need to knock someone out, correlates almost perfectly with a single physical property: how easily the substance dissolves in olive oil. Olive oil. I'm not joking. They literally measured how well various anesthetics dissolved in oil versus water, calculated the oil-water partition coefficient, and plotted it against anesthetic potency. And they got a nearly perfect straight line. The more soluble a substance is in oil, the better it is at producing anesthesia. This held across an enormous range of compounds. Ether, chloroform, nitrous oxide, noble gases like xenon, even plain old nitrogen at high pressure, all fell on the same line. Why olive oil? Because olive oil is a lipid, a fat, and cell membranes are made of lipids. Every neuron in your brain is wrapped in a lipid bilayer, a double sheet of fat molecules that forms the barrier between inside and outside. The Meyer-Overton correlation suggested that anesthetics work not by binding to specific protein receptors, but by dissolving into the lipid membranes of neurons and somehow disrupting their function. That was a radical idea. Most drugs work by interacting with specific proteins. Anesthetics, according to this picture, work by soaking into the cell membrane itself, into the fat, which would explain why so many different molecules can do it. You don't need a specific shape to dissolve in fat. You just need to be fat-soluble. For about 100 years, this was the leading theory. The lipid hypothesis. Anesthetics dissolve into neuronal membranes, change their physical properties, maybe make them swell slightly, maybe change their fluidity, and this somehow interferes with the function of the ion channels and proteins embedded in those membranes. The membrane is like a pond, the proteins are like boats floating on it, and the anesthetic is like changing the viscosity of the water. Everything sitting in the membrane shifts a little, and that's enough to disrupt signaling. Elegant. Simple. Explains the diversity. Explains the Meyer-Overton line. But there are problems. Big problems. Starting in the 1980s and 90s, evidence began to accumulate that the lipid hypothesis couldn't be the whole story. First, researchers found exceptions to the Meyer-Overton correlation. Certain molecules that should be excellent anesthetics based on their oil solubility turned out to have no anesthetic effect at all. These were called non-immobilizers. Fat-soluble, check. Should dissolve in membranes, check. Should produce anesthesia, according to the theory. But they didn't. The line wasn't as perfect as it first appeared. Second, people calculated how much the membrane would actually change when anesthetic molecules dissolved into it. The answer was not much. The expansion, the fluidity change, was tiny, on the order of what you'd get from raising the body temperature by 1 degree. And raising someone's temperature by 1 degree definitely doesn't make them unconscious. Third, and most damaging, researchers began identifying specific protein targets for certain anesthetics. Propofol, for instance, binds to a specific site on the GABA receptor. a protein that sits in neuronal membranes and controls the flow of chloride ions into the cell. When GABA A is activated, it lets chloride in, making the neuron less likely to fire. Propofol enhances this effect. It makes GABA A receptors stay open longer, flooding neurons with chloride, silencing them. Ketamine works differently. It blocks NMDA receptors, which are excitatory. Instead of turning up the brakes, it blocks the gas pedal. Different mechanism. Same result, reduced neural activity. Volatile anesthetics like isoflurane and sevoflurane seem to act on multiple targets simultaneously. GABA A receptors, glycine receptors, certain potassium channels, certain sodium channels. They're messy. They don't have one clean target. They're hitting multiple systems at once. So the picture shifted. From the 1990s onward, the protein hypothesis gained ground. Anesthetics don't just dissolve into membranes randomly. They interact with specific proteins, enhancing inhibitory channels, blocking excitatory ones, altering the electrical behavior of neurons through targeted molecular interactions. Case closed? Hardly. Because here's the problem. We now know some of the molecular targets. We know that propofol hits GABA A. We know ketamine hits NMDA. Fine. But knowing which receptor a drug binds to is not the same as understanding why binding to that receptor makes consciousness disappear. Think about it. GABA A receptors are everywhere in the brain. When propofol enhances them, it reduces the firing rate of neurons across wide swaths of the cortex and subcortical structures. Okay, but why does reducing neuronal firing rates abolish consciousness? You'd think it would just make you drowsy, sluggish, slow. Why does it produce a complete blackout of subjective experience? Why is there a threshold, a tipping point, where you go from groggy to gone? And here's an even sharper version of the question. Alcohol acts on GABA receptors too. So do benzodiazepines, like diazepam. So do barbiturates. They all enhance inhibitory neurotransmission. But they don't all produce the same state. Alcohol makes you drunk,